This story is about a rookie night shift taxi driver named Mia. Mia also works a part-time job during the day, so the only shift she can take for driving is the night shift. It helps her cover her expenses without taking up her daytime hours. It's tiring, but she doesn't really have a choice. She just has to push through it. When it comes to navigation, though, Mia really isn't that confident. She knows the main roads on Hong Kong Island well enough, but once she enters those winding, complicated areas filled with narrow backstreets, she almost always has to rely on GPS. To minimize mistakes, she sticks to a routine every night. She circles around Causeway Bay, especially near Times Square, an area she's familiar with where there are always enough passengers. For a beginner, it's the safest bet. That night was a Thursday, a little after 1 a.m. The weather was strangely still, no rain, no wind, and the air felt almost unnaturally heavy. Usually Thursday nights were still fairly lively, but for some reason the streets were unusually quiet, with only a few people wandering slowly in the distance. That night, Mia had already looped the area twice and had only managed to pick up one passenger. The last drop-off ended in a fairly remote district. Places like this were usually quiet at 1 or 2 in the morning, but tonight the silence felt different. Unnaturally still. A long row of streetlights lit up an empty road, and she couldn't hear so much as insects or wind. Mia was about to turn around and head back toward the city center. She needed to find proper passengers to keep the shift going. Just as she signaled and slowly prepared to make the turn, something moved at the edge of her vision. Beside a small taxi stand nearby, a man was standing at the roadside, waving at her. At first, Mia thought she was seeing things. At this time, in this kind of place, it didn't make sense for anyone to be hailing a cab. She slowed down to get a clearer look, but the closer she looked, the stranger he seemed. The man wasn't very tall, and his build was so thin it felt almost unnatural. He was wearing a tracksuit, but the strangest part was the color. Mia couldn't describe it at all. He had a baseball cap pulled so low over his face that it covered most of it, leaving only his jawline visible. No eyes, no expression, no real sense of age. Mia felt a small drop in her stomach. If the surroundings hadn't been so quiet, and if she didn't feel awkward about refusing a passenger, she might have stepped on the gas and driven away. But the man had already walked up to her window and tapped on it lightly. His voice was soft, cold, almost flat, as he said just one thing. City Center. That was it. No small talk, no confirming an address, no reaction of any kind. Mia didn't feel comfortable at all, but with him standing so close, she had no real reason to refuse him. She reluctantly unlocked the door and let him in. Mia glanced at the rearview mirror and saw the man sitting in the corner of the back seat, head lowered, the brim of his cap hiding his entire face. He wasn't on his phone, wasn't adjusting his bag, wasn't moving at all. His hands rested neatly on his knees, completely still, so still he looked more like a shadow than a person. Although the situation gave Mia a faint sense of unease, she kept her manners and asked, "Where in the city center do you want to get off?" The man didn't react, not even a nod. Mia tried again. "Which part of the city center?" Silence. Absolute silence from the back seat. A discomfort began to settle in her chest, but new drivers often meet passengers who simply don't want to talk. Most of the time, it just means the person is in a bad mood or doesn't feel like socializing. So Mia didn't push further. As the car continued moving outward, the surrounding lights grew fewer and farther apart. Mia knew that to leave this remote area, she had to pass through a narrow, winding mountain road. She wasn't very familiar with it to begin with, so her mind and her focus tightened even more than usual. The entrance of the mountain road was still relatively clear, but less than a minute after she drove in, Mia noticed her visibility starting to blur. At first, it was just a thin layer of mist, like someone had sprayed a puff of white smoke into the air. But then it gathered, thicker and thicker, almost as if some unseen force was pushing a pale, heavy mass out from between the trees, slowly pressing it down onto the road. She slowed down, her grip on the steering wheel tightening without her noticing. The headlights illuminated nothing but a wall of white. Even the lane markings flickered in and out of visibility. She rarely encountered fog this sudden, especially at this time of night and in this kind of weather. None of it made sense. The back seat was still silent, and the man's complete lack of reaction only made Mia more tense. She stole a glance at the rearview mirror, but she saw the same thing as before, just a figure swallowed by shadow, without the slightest movement. Mia continued down the mountain road carefully, the fog growing thicker and thicker until her headlights could only cut through barely 10 meters ahead. After passing a wide curve, the fog in front of her suddenly thinned just enough for the road to become slightly clearer. Mia was just about to let out a breath of relief when her headlights caught something that froze her entire body in an instant. Standing in the middle of the road was a line of small figures. A whole row of them, perfectly aligned, slowly crossing from one side of the mountain road to the other. They weren't tall, and their steps were unnervingly synchronized, every movement matching the next, far too regular to be natural. Nothing about them resembled what should appear on a mountain road like this, at this hour, in this weather. Mia's mind went blank. Her instincts kicked in, and she immediately hit the horn. The sound blasted through the fog, but the figures didn't react at all. No stopping, no turning their heads, no speeding up. They continued moving with the exact same steady rhythm. Their complete indifference made Mia's heartbeat spike. Sweat started forming in her palms. She slammed the brake, and the wheels skidded slightly on the damp mountain road. The car slowed, but the gap was closing fast. Swerving was the only way to avoid hitting them. She knew she didn't have time. Logic told her to swerve, but something deeper was dragging her hand back. Just as she forced herself to commit and turn the wheel, the man who hadn't spoken a single word since getting into the car suddenly barked out, "Don't swerve, go straight." His voice was low, urgent, and commanding, so abrupt and forceful that Mia jolted in her seat. It startled her so much that her fingers froze on the edge of the steering wheel, hesitating for half a second. And in that tiny moment of hesitation, a sudden rush of movement came from the back seat, like someone had leaned forward sharply. The next second, a cold, thin, but impossibly strong hand shot forward from behind her and clamped tightly around Mia's left wrist. The grip was so fierce she let out a small gasp. The strength wasn't just a panicked reflex. It felt like a desperate, absolute need to stop her, as if he understood far better than she did what would happen if she turned. The figures ahead were now less than a meter from the car. All she could do was brake as much as she could, slow the car to the minimum speed while still moving straight. In the next moment, they would hit the figures. But something impossible happened. Just as the car was about to collide with them, the line of small silhouettes dissolved, like smoke torn apart by a sudden gust of wind. They faded, split, and vanished soundlessly, and the fog flowed into the empty space they left behind. The car passed straight through as if nothing had been there at all. Mia froze for 2 full seconds, mind blank, breath tangled, throat too dry to form any sound. Before she could even begin to comprehend what had happened, a blinding white light appeared ahead. A speeding car burst out of the fog directly in front of them, rushing past their hood with terrifying force. The gust of air rocked Mia's taxi violently. If she had swerved, she would have driven straight into the opposite lane, directly into that speeding car. Only after they passed through the empty stretch of road did the man finally speak again. His voice was low, steady, almost too calm for what had just happened. If you had turned, not just turned, even hesitated another half second, you wouldn't be alive right now. Mia's hands were still trembling slightly, her mind stuck on the eerie scene she had just gone through. Even after the car made it back to the main road, she felt a heavy weight of lingering fear pressing against her chest. After a long stretch of silence, she finally couldn't hold back and asked quietly, How did you know from the beginning that they weren't human?" Her voice was rough, carrying real unease and confusion. There was no reply from the back seat. The man kept his head lowered, the brim of his cap covering most of his face, his posture unnaturally still. It felt wrong, almost as if the person who saved her earlier wasn't actually the same person sitting behind her now. The rest of the drive back to the city center was so quiet that only the engine could be heard. From time to time, Mia glanced into the rearview mirror, but the man's position never shifted. He stayed exactly the same, like a shadow instead of an actual passenger. She thought about asking another question, but in the end, she held it in. All she wanted was to finish this trip as soon as possible. When they reached the destination, the man lifted his head, opened the door, stepped out, and paid. Every motion perfectly normal, almost too normal, to the point of feeling off. He didn't say anything, didn't look back, and simply walked into the pool of streetlight and disappeared into the night. Before driving away, Mia instinctively checked the rearview mirror again. The back seat was completely empty. Only the slight indentation on the cushion remained. No marks, no trace. Normal to a disturbing degree. When Mia finally got home, she still couldn't calm down. The fog, the strange row of figures, and the sudden strength the passenger unleashed, all of it replayed in her mind again and again. Even now, she had no idea what she had encountered that night, nor could she understand how the man was so certain that those figures weren't living people and were trying to lure her into turning the wheel and crashing. There was only one thing Mia knew for sure. If she had followed her instinct and swerved, the outcome would not have been just a simple accident. And as for that passenger, who was he? How did he know what was ahead? And was he even human to begin with? Every time Mia thought about it, a chill ran down her spine. If you enjoy this story, remember to leave a like and tell me in the comments.